Sometimes, it's the simplest moments in life that carry the most profound lessons. A quiet act of courage, a stand against injustice, or even a silent show of unity can ripple through a community and change lives forever. Welcome back to Hopeful Horizon, where we bring you stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the power of the human spirit. Today's story is one of compassion, courage, and the quiet strength of those who refuse to turn a blind eye to injustice. In a bustling city, Leah, a pregnant woman, boards a crowded bus. What begins as an ordinary commute quickly turns into an intense standoff between a wealthy businessman and a young soldier. The passengers, despite their differences, find themselves standing together, rallying around Leah in a display of unity that changes everything. Stay with us as we explore how this moment of defiance against prejudice unfolds and how one man's arrogance leads to his ultimate downfall. If you love tales filled with unexpected twists and life-changing moments, be sure to comment below where you're listening from. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss an inspiring story from Hopeful Horizon. It was a cool, crisp autumn morning in the heart of the city, where towering buildings cast long shadows over the bustling streets below. The sun had just started its slow ascent, its warm light cutting through the cold air and reflecting off the glass windows of high-rise offices. The city was alive with energy, the constant hum of traffic, the rhythmic tap of hurried footsteps, and the distant murmur of morning conversations filling the streets. Leah stood at the crowded bus stop, a protective hand resting gently on her swollen belly. Her face, although lined with the exhaustion of late pregnancy, carried a serene glow. It was that unmistakable radiance that only expectant mothers seem to possess, the quiet contentment of someone who knows their life is about to change in a profound way. She was 8 months along, and her child was becoming more active with each passing day, offering gentle nudges as if reminding her of its presence. Her other hand gripped the strap of a well-worn leather handbag, the same one she had used throughout her pregnancy to carry her essentials, prenatal vitamins, a small water bottle, and the latest book on preparing for motherhood. Today, however, her thoughts were consumed with the upcoming doctor's appointment. It was a routine checkup, but with the due date fast approaching, Leah felt both excitement and anxiety brewing within her. As she waited for the bus, Leah glanced around at the other commuters, most of them absorbed in their own morning routines, checking phones, sipping coffee, or chatting with companions. She was alone, as usual, but that didn't bother her. Being pregnant had given her a sense of self-sufficiency, a quiet confidence that she hadn't possessed before. The bus approached with a hiss of its brakes, the doors sliding open with a familiar metallic clunk. Leah hesitated for a moment, her hand instinctively tightening on the strap of her bag before she carefully stepped up into the vehicle. Inside, the air was warm and slightly stuffy, filled with the mingling scents of cologne, coffee, and the faint mustiness of worn leather seats. The bus was just as crowded as she had expected, every seat taken, and a handful of passengers already standing, gripping the overhead rails. Leah scanned the interior, her eyes moving from face to face. She wasn't expecting a seat to be readily available, but she held out hope. Her eyes landed on an empty spot beside an elderly man with kind, wrinkled eyes. He looked up from his newspaper and met her gaze with a soft smile. Before Leah could make her way to the seat, a sharp, condescending voice cut through the chatter of the bus. "Sorry, lady, but that seat's taken." The voice belonged to Kevin Matthews, a man in his mid-40s who oozed entitlement from every pore. He sat in the seat beside the elderly man, his briefcase occupying the seat next to him. His sleek, tailored gray suit and polished black shoes contrasted sharply with the worn interiors of the bus. His posture was rigid, almost as if he wanted to separate himself from the common commuters around him. In his hand, he clutched an expensive smartphone, scrolling through emails or stock reports, paying no attention to the world around him. Leah paused, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel the weight of her baby pressing down on her, making her legs ache from the exertion of standing. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm pregnant, and I could really use the seat. If it's not too much trouble." Kevin didn't even glance up. "I don't care what your situation is," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "I got here first, and that seat is mine." He gestured vaguely toward his briefcase, as if the inanimate object deserved the seat more than she did. Leah blinked, momentarily stunned by his rudeness. She had expected maybe a grunt of reluctance or a mumbled excuse, but not this. This cold indifference, this complete disregard for her condition. She looked around, hoping that someone else might intervene, but the other passengers averted their gazes, lost in their own thoughts or too afraid to get involved. Just as Leah was about to give up and retreat to the back of the bus to stand, a voice rang out from the front. It was firm, steady, and filled with an underlying edge of authority. "Hey man, what's your problem?" The voice belonged to Ryan, a young soldier standing near the front of the bus. His frame was tall and muscular, his broad shoulders straining against the green fabric of his military jacket. His hair was buzzed short, in typical military fashion, and his face carried a sense of quiet determination. This was someone who had seen conflict, who had been through trials far more difficult than a morning commute. Ryan had noticed Leah the moment she had stepped onto the bus. He had watched as her hopeful gaze landed on the empty seat, only to be dismissed by Kevin's cruel indifference. It had stirred something deep inside him, something primal, a need to protect, to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. It was a lesson he had learned during his time in the military, where camaraderie and solidarity were everything. Kevin didn't bother to look up at Ryan either, though his lips curled into a sneer. "Not that it's any of your business," Kevin replied coolly, still scrolling through his phone, "but I'm not moving. If she wanted a seat so bad, she should have gotten here earlier." Ryan's expression darkened. He stepped closer, his presence looming over Kevin like a storm cloud. "She's pregnant," Ryan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "Show some respect." For the first time, Kevin looked up, his cold blue eyes meeting Ryan's intense gaze. "And I have a meeting in 10 minutes, Kevin shot back, his tone smug and dismissive. "So I'm not moving. We all have problems, pal." Ryan clenched his fists, the muscles in his jaw tightening. He had encountered men like Kevin before, men who thought their wealth or status gave them the right to treat others like dirt, men who had never faced real adversity in their lives and wouldn't know integrity if it slapped them in the face. Ryan had spent years fighting for the freedom and safety of others, and to see someone so blatantly disregard another human being, especially a pregnant woman, made his blood boil. Leah, sensing the rising tension, tried to intervene. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice shaky. "I can stand. It's not a big deal." Ryan turned to her, his expression softening. "No, it's not okay," he said firmly. "You shouldn't have to stand when there's a perfectly good seat right here." The atmosphere on the bus had shifted dramatically. What had once been a routine commute was now thick with tension, like the moments before a summer thunderstorm. Passengers who had previously been engrossed in their phones or conversations were now watching the confrontation unfold with wide eyes. Some exchanged glances, as if silently debating whether or not to get involved, while others remained frozen, unwilling to disrupt the precarious balance. The elderly man, David, who had been quietly reading his newspaper beside Kevin, set it down with a sigh. His gray hair was neatly combed, and he wore a worn but well-kept overcoat that had clearly seen many winters. He had the look of someone who had lived through enough to know when a situation was about to escalate. "Young man," David began, his voice soft but steady, "there's no harm in doing the right thing. Let the lady sit." Kevin, clearly irritated now, rolled his eyes. "Look, I'm not obligated to give up my seat for anyone. I got here first, and that's that. End of story." Ryan took a deep breath, his fists still clenched. He was trying his best to keep his cool, but Kevin's arrogance was pushing him to the edge. He glanced at Leah, who was now looking down at her feet, her face flushed with embarrassment. Ryan's heart ached for her. She didn't deserve this. "I'm not asking," Ryan said, his voice dangerously low. "I'm telling you, move." The entire bus seemed to hold its breath. Kevin's sneer faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, a mocking smile spreading across his face. "Or what?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You gonna make me?" Ryan stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "If I have to," he replied, his tone leaving no room for doubt. At this point, several passengers began to murmur among themselves. Some were clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation, while others seemed to be rooting for Ryan. One woman, seated near the back of the bus, leaned over to her friend and whispered, "I hope he knocks that jerk out." Leah, feeling the tension rising to an unbearable level, spoke up again. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want any trouble. I'll stand. It's fine." But it wasn't fine, and everyone on the bus knew it. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about something bigger. It was about respect, about decency, about standing up for what was right. And Ryan wasn't going to back down. As the confrontation between Ryan and Kevin continued to escalate, something remarkable began to happen. The other passengers, who had initially been silent observers, started to shift in their seats. One by one, they began to speak up, their voices joining together in a chorus of solidarity. A woman sitting near the front, her arms crossed over her chest, spoke up first. "Give her the seat," she said firmly, glaring at Kevin. "You're acting like a child." Another man, this one standing near the back, chimed in. "Yeah, man, show some respect." The murmurs of agreement grew louder, spreading throughout the bus like wildfire. People who had previously been hesitant to get involved were now emboldened, their collective frustration with Kevin's behavior boiling over. "Come on, dude," said a younger guy in a hoodie, shaking his head in disbelief. "It's just a seat. Let the lady sit." Kevin, sensing the tide turning against him, began to look nervous. He glanced around at the sea of angry faces, his confidence faltering, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. Not yet. "You all need to mind your own business," Kevin snapped, his voice shaky. "This is between me and her." Ryan, who had been standing silently as the crowd rallied behind him, took a step back and crossed his arms over his chest. "It's not just between you and her anymore," he said calmly. "Everyone here sees what's happening and they're not okay with it." Leah, still standing beside Ryan, felt a surge of gratitude wash over her. She had never expected this kind of support from total strangers, and it touched her deeply. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. At that moment, a woman from the back of the bus stood up and marched toward Kevin. Her name was Emily, and she had had enough. She was an ordinary woman, mid-30s, with a no-nonsense demeanor and a fierce sense of justice. She had seen too many injustices in her life, and she wasn't about to let this one slide. "Move," Emily demanded, her voice firm and unwavering. Kevin opened his mouth to protest, but Emily wasn't having it. She reached down, grabbed his briefcase, and tossed it into the aisle with a thud. "I said move." Kevin's mouth hung open in shock as he watched his briefcase hit the floor. He blinked, his mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. The once composed businessman, always so in control of his surroundings, was now at the mercy of a bus full of angry passengers. I can't believe you just did that," Kevin stammered, his voice faltering. Emily crossed her arms and stared him down. "Believe it. Now, either get up or I'll make you." Kevin looked around, his gaze flickering from face to face, searching for some form of support. But there was none. Every eye on the bus was fixed on him, every face filled with contempt and disgust. Even the elderly man beside him, who had remained silent for most of the ride, was now shaking his head in disappointment. With a heavy sigh, Kevin stood up, his movements stiff and robotic. The bus was deathly silent as he stepped into the aisle, the weight of his humiliation settling over him like a heavy blanket. He couldn't bring himself to look at anyone as he retrieved his briefcase from the floor and moved toward the back of the bus. Leah, feeling a mix of relief and gratitude, carefully lowered herself into the now empty seat. She let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her bag on her lap. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ryan smiled softly at her. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "You deserve respect, just like anyone else." As the bus continued its journey through the city, the passengers gradually returned to their previous routines, though the atmosphere remained charged with the memory of what had just transpired. Emily returned to her seat, her expression calm but resolute. She had done what needed to be done, and she felt no regret. But for Kevin, the confrontation wasn't over. The moment Kevin stepped off the bus, he felt the full weight of his actions crash down on him. His phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, but he ignored it, his mind racing. He had always prided himself on being in control, on being the man who got things done. But today, he had been completely outmaneuvered by a bus full of strangers, and worse, his pride had led him to make a fool of himself in front of them all. Later that day, Kevin sat in his corner office, staring blankly at his computer screen. The view of the city's skyline, usually so comforting, now felt oppressive, as if the towering buildings were closing in on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life was starting to unravel. It was then that his assistant, Anna, knocked on the door and entered the office. She looked nervous, her hands fidgeting with the stack of papers she carried. "Mr. Matthews," Anna began, her voice hesitant, I think you should know that there's a video of you from this morning. It's gone viral." Kevin's heart sank. "A video?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Anna nodded, her expression sympathetic. "Yes, from the bus. Someone recorded the whole thing. It's all over social media now and, well, people aren't exactly happy." Before Kevin could respond, the door to his office swung open with a force that startled both him and Anna. In strode Mr. Richards, the CEO of the company, a tall, imposing figure with a no-nonsense demeanor. His face was stern, his eyes hard as steel, and the usual calm professionalism in his bearing was replaced by an unmistakable anger. Kevin knew immediately that this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation, but Mr. Richards wasn't alone. Following closely behind him was a man that Kevin recognized instantly, Ryan's father, David Richards. He was a decorated veteran who had become a well-respected figure in the business world after his military service. David's presence added an extra layer of gravity to the situation, and Kevin's stomach dropped. David Richards was known for his integrity and sense of justice. His military background had earned him not just respect, but a reputation for standing up for what was right, no matter the personal cost. Seeing him now, flanked by his son's CEO, made Kevin feel as if he were being judged, not just by his employers, but by a moral authority much greater than his professional world. Kevin's voice faltered as he greeted them. "Mr. Richards, David, Mr. Richards didn't allow him to finish. He held up a hand, a sharp gesture that silenced Kevin instantly. "You've put this company in a very difficult position," Mr. Richards began, his voice like ice. "We value integrity here, and what happened on that bus this morning is the opposite of everything we stand for." Kevin could feel the sweat beating on his forehead. He glanced at David Richards, whose piercing gaze felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. David stood silently, arms crossed over his chest, but his presence was palpable, a silent witness to Kevin's downfall. "You humiliated yourself in front of a bus full of people," Mr. Richards continued, his voice rising slightly. "That's one thing, but to refuse to give up your seat to a pregnant woman, and then to be confronted by a young soldier, Ryan no less, my COO's son, and to still not do the right thing?" His tone was incredulous, filled with both anger and disappointment. "How could you?" Kevin's face burned with shame. The events of the morning flashed through his mind, the confrontation, Ryan standing up to him, the crowd rallying against him. And now, to find out that Ryan, the soldier who had put him in his place, was the son of David Richards, his boss's closest advisor and a man he had long admired from afar. The humiliation was unbearable. I didn't know who he was," Kevin stammered, his voice weak and defensive. "I didn't realize—" "That's the point, Kevin," David Richards finally spoke, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with basic respect. It doesn't matter if it was my son or a complete stranger. What you did was wrong, plain and simple." Kevin swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He had no response to that. David's words stung because they were the truth, and there was no way to wriggle out of it. He had let his arrogance and entitlement blind him to what was right. "You've not only damaged your own reputation," Mr. Richards said, shaking his head, "but you've damaged this company's reputation as well. We cannot have someone like you representing us, not after this." Kevin felt the walls closing in. His entire career, everything he had worked for, was crumbling before his eyes. He opened his mouth to protest, to try and explain, but David Richards wasn't finished. "I taught my son to stand up for what's right," David said, his voice steady and unwavering. "And he did just that. I'm proud of him. But I'm deeply disappointed in you, Kevin. I always thought you were better than this." Those words cut deeper than anything else. Kevin had looked up to David Richards, admired him from a distance, and now to hear the disappointment in his voice, it was crushing. Mr. Richards exchanged a glance with David, then turned back to Kevin. "I'm giving you a choice," he said, his tone hard as steel. "Either you resign quietly, or I'll make sure you're fired. And trust me, Kevin, it won't be pretty." The room seemed to close in on Kevin. His mind raced, but he knew there was no way out of this, no way to salvage his career, his reputation. His actions that morning had sealed his fate. With a heavy heart and a bitter taste in his mouth, Kevin nodded. "I'll resign," he whispered. David Richards nodded, his expression softening slightly, but there was no joy in his eyes, only a quiet, somber acknowledgement that justice had been served. Without another word, Mr. Richards turned on his heel and left the office, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. David Richards followed, pausing only briefly to give Kevin one last, lingering look, a look that said everything Kevin already knew. And then they were gone, leaving Kevin alone in the suffocating silence of his office. And there you have it, a moment of courage that not only changed the life of one person, but sent ripples through an entire community. When we stand up for what's right, we remind others of the power of unity, compassion, and the simple act of doing the right thing. We hope you found today's story both inspiring and thought-provoking. If this message resonated with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Remember to subscribe to Hopeful Horizon and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story that can change your perspective and maybe even your life.